a lovely war. Oh, it's a lovely war. To be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take.
Hi folks, and welcome to the Military Collect podcast. For this episode, we have a very special guest, Ian Brown, who's the curator of the National Museum of Flight at East Fortune. The location of the site itself sits on the former RAF East Fortune, which history spans as far back as the First World War. Over the years, it's seen many changes and many different squadrons come into the area. If you were to go to the site today, you'll find 3 hangars. One of them is military aviation, the other is for civilian aircraft, and the third one holds the famous Concorde. As well as that, there's a number of other little features that you can go to, such as the old billets, where you can find a number of items on display and stories being told of those who served at RAF East Fortune during the war. There's also a number of buildings and vehicles on display around the site. My personal favourite is the Vulcan bomber. And if you're hungry or want a quick drink, you can stop off by the little cafe that they have on the site. Anyway folks, I hope you enjoy our chat with Ian. Thank you. We're joined here today with Ian, who's the curator here at the museum. Ian, thanks very much for taking the time for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
First of all, I'll need to ask, what was the purpose of the airfield?
So this airfield originally opened in 1915. Originally it had airships. So the idea was you had originally non-rigid, so it was like a hot air balloon but more torpedo shaped. They didn't have a structure inside, it was just a big bag of hydrogen. Then they moved on to rigid airships. They had a structure inside, so they were, it was just this metal structure but then covered in a fabric. But their purpose was to go out over the North Sea looking for U-boats trying to attack convoys down the East Coast. Later on, there was aircraft here as well, and actually in 1916 there was 2 Zeppelins attacked Edinburgh, and there was an aircraft took off from here to try and shoot them down, but because there was no radar, there was no ground aids at that time, he didn't find them, came back to East Fortune and crashed and landed and was really badly injured. But that was all operated by the Royal Naval Air Service. So it was essentially the air branch of the Royal Navy. And then in 1918, that was merged with the Royal Flying Corps, which was part of the Army, to form the Royal Air Force. So basically overnight, all these guys who'd been in the Royal Navy were suddenly in the Royal Air Force. But even for months afterwards, you still see them wearing the Royal Navy uniform, and they were still using Royal Naval ranks. And so there's a mix of the new RAF ranks, the old Royal Navy ranks, and some of them had come over from the Army, so you were getting Army ranks as well. So it took quite a while before the Royal Air Force itself was, even though it was formed on the 1st of April 1918, it took a while for it to kind of be properly established. So that was, we got fixed-wing aircraft. One of them tried to shoot down these Zeppelins. So they were here as a sort of home defence squadron. Latterly, there was another unit that was training with aircraft called Sopwith Cuckoos. So they were training as a torpedo attack squadron. Actually, they developed all the techniques for dropping torpedoes from aeroplanes, which would then be used in the British attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto in 1940, and essentially copied with the Japanese when they attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. That all started here. So the first aircraft to drop torpedoes were based here at East Fortune. And it was all highly secret. The idea was they were going to go and attack the German High Seas Fleet in Kiel, but the war ended before that took place. So potentially a suicidal mission, but it never actually happened.
Am I correct in saying when the German High Sea Fleet surrendered, when it came into the Forth, the airship that recorded their arrival into the Forth, did that set off from here?
Yeah, there was a couple of what they call the North Sea class. So they were non-rigids, and so they were above the German fleet, and obviously there was a British Home Seas fleet was there escorting them in as well. It was a little cruiser HMS Cardiff that was in front of the German high seas fleets that came in the 4th. But yeah, it was being watched over by airships just in case. So they would have dropped depth charges or bombs on the German ships if they tried anything. And yeah, one of the other airships that was based here, sort of just after the end of the war, the R-34, which was rigid, copied off a German Zeppelin that had been shot down in 1916, was based here. So it was more of a kind of long-range bomber, but never actually used in that role. And in July, 2 weeks after Alcock and Brown did the first non-stop crossing the Atlantic, the R-34 left from here to fly to America and back again. So it was the first east-west crossing, which obviously is more difficult because you're going against the jet stream, but also the first return crossing. And one of the crew, because the Americans had never handled airships, he parachuted out from the R-34 to take command of the ground crew. So the first person to arrive in America from air was a guy who parachuted out of an airship that left from here. So yeah, I mean, quite an important historical airfield. I mean, it basically lay dormant between the wars. Then in 1940, it was taken over again by the RAF. They sort of built the runways that still exist now, and it was used from 1941 as a night fighter operational training unit. So it was crews from all over the Commonwealth and the free countries, so free Belgians, free Poles, free French, were all coming here to learn, to get the sort of final training before they were posted on to operational squadrons. It was mostly flying Defiants and Blenheims. Then in November 1942, that unit was renumbered, reallocated, moved to Coastal Command, and was from then was used for anti-shipping strike training. So kind of reverting back to what it had been the First World War for torpedo dropping purposes. And then it was mostly Blenheims, then Bullfighters, and eventually Mosquitoes. And that was, so it was the two operational training units throughout the Second World War.
In the Second World War, it was obviously a very key position where the airfield was, because we've got the 4th just along here, we've got Rosyth, and of course the dockyards in Leith and the 4th Rail Bridge. So it would have been a common sight to see German bombers coming over here attempting to hit these targets. So do we know which squadrons were stationed here during the Second World War?
There was never any operational squadrons here. The nearest ones, when the airfield reopened in 1940, it was originally a satellite to Drem, which is only a few miles up the road, and that was one of the main fighter stations. So it was between Turnhouse and Drem were the two main fighter airfields for the area. So Drem had a whole range of, it was originally 602 with Spitfires. It ended up as a night fighter station. It had various Spitfire squadrons went on to Bullfighters, I think, and Mosquitoes, and Turnhouse as well. It was Spitfires, Hurricanes, Defiants, lots of different squadrons passed through. But yeah, there was never any operational squadrons here.
We noticed when we were walking around the outside that you've got a lot of blast shelters. Was the airfield itself ever targeted at some point?
The airfield was never bombed. Obviously they had to, when the airfield was built in 1940, lots of airfields were being attacked, but particularly down the south of England. So there was always the risk. This airfield was never bombed. Haddington, which is just a handful of miles down the road, it was bombed. With loss of life, but yeah, the airfield itself wasn't. But yeah, they built all that protection in just in case.
So, following the end of the war, what became of the airfield? Was it still in RAF hands right after the war, or was it decommissioned like so many others?
It remained in RAF hands until 1947, I think it was. It was offered to the US Air Force as a potential base. and actually they extended one of the runways for for potential jet operations. But the Americans didn't take up the offer, which seems surprising considering the number of good golf courses there are around about here. So it then got basically put in care and maintenance, and then disposed of, returned back to the landowner. So it was sold back to the farmer, and basically it's been used mostly for agriculture since. I mean, part of the airfield is still used as a motorcycle racing circuit. For many years, the farmer operated a Sunday market, but sadly with online auction sites, it's kind of fallen by the wayside. And then in the 1950s, because part of the airfield was still retained by the government, so it was the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. So they used what's now the museum site, the technical site of the airfield, for emergency food storage. So if there had been a nuclear war, this would have been what they called a buffer depot that stored food. So the idea would be, after a nuclear holocaust, potentially the population's been reduced to medieval numbers. So in order to grow enough food, you'd have to motivate people. So basically, food stocks would be used as a kind of carrot and stick. So if you worked, you would be given food as a reward, but if you didn't, you wouldn't get any food. And potentially with a nuclear winter, you wouldn't be able to grow your own food and all that kind of stuff. So there was sort of flour, hardtack biscuits, boiled sweets, peanut fat, basically high energy foods were stored here. It was also used to store green goddess fire engines. So obviously, again, a nuclear war, the auxiliary fire service would have been used, as they would have been during the Second World War, would have been used to help put out fires. So the green goddesses were based here in various places around the country. And that carried on well into the 80s, I think it was. By that stage, part of the site had, in 1971, what was the Royal Scottish Museum, it's now National Museum of Scotland, was given the use of one of the hangars because we had been offered a Spitfire by the Ministry of Defence, but we didn't know where to display it. So it was stored in one of the hangars here, and then we got some aircraft from Lossiemouth was changing from being a Royal Naval Air Station back to RAF. So some of the ground instructional airframes they had there came here. We already had a collection of rocketry, but gradually we sort of filled a hangar then and filled another one and took over most of the site. So the museum finally opened to visitors in 1975, and we've been here ever since, and gradually increased the displays and brought more and more aircraft into the hangars with displays like this as not just collecting the aircraft but trying to tell stories of the crews of the aircraft as well.
I've noticed as well you've got a lot of displays where it's actually telling you the individual stories of people that were posted here during the conflicts. What would you say is your favourite item here that's on display? It doesn't have to be any individual item, it can be an aircraft as well, but in your own personal view, what would you say your favourite is?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those difficult questions. It's like asking you, who's your favourite child? For me, it links back to what you're saying about the personal stories. I mean, certainly my favourite aircraft is a General Aircraft Signet, which is in our civil hangar, funnily enough, which was built as a 1930s light aircraft, but it was one of these types that was in present RAF service. So although it's in a civil hangar, it's painted in camouflage colours with RAF roundels. And the reason I love that aircraft is I mean, there was only about 12 of them built, so it's not well known. People would generally walk past it and not give it a second glance. But what's interesting about it is that the specific aircraft we have was flown twice by Guy Gibson, who led the Dambusters raids, because it was used at a similar unit to what was here, a night fighter operational training unit. Gibson, between tours, was sent there as chief flying instructor. And that was at a time when they were looking at using the American Douglas Boston /Havoc as a night fighter. And it had a tricycle undercarriage. And of course, most pilots at that time were used to tail draggers. So they were using the Signet, which is a nose wheel, to train crews and just landing, taking off, handling an aircraft with a tricycle undercarriage rather than a tail wheel. And if you look in Guy Gibson's logbook, and we have a reproduction of it here, I think the original's in the RAF Museum in London, but if you look at his logbook, that aircraft is in there twice with him. So we know his bum has been on the seat. And that, to me, is what makes my job interesting, but makes collections like this interesting, is that aircraft's just a lump of metal. But it's the story behind it and the story of the people who flew it that makes it interesting.
Definitely. Me personally, I'm going to be a bit boring here when I say this, because no doubt you've probably heard this many a times. Me personally, I've got to say it's the Vulcan. I absolutely love the Vulcan. Ever since I've been a wee boy, I've always been fascinated by it. I think the main thing that draws me to it is, of course, the famous howl. The howl of the engine. But I've noticed that your one here has got quite a funny story in regards to the crew following its involvement in the bombing raids in the Falklands. Had to be diverted and land in Brazil.
Yeah.
What was the reason for that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. That's one of the big crowd pleasers here. And I have to say, I'm old enough just to having seen it display when it was still the RAF that flew it as the Vulcan display team. So I've seen it do sort of high G manoeuvres and things, and yeah, there was nothing like it. But yeah, I mean, our Vulcan is particularly interesting because it's participated in the Black Buck missions during the Falklands War and did Black Buck 5 and 6. So it wasn't the one that bombed the runway at Port Stanley, but it was Black Bucks 5 and 6 were tasked with attacking Argentinian radars defending the airfield. And on Black Buck 6, it managed to destroy one of the radars and actually killed, I think it was 2 of the Argentinian crew, which were enemies then. Obviously, it's still someone's son or brother or whatever, so it's still a loss of life. But on that second mission, obviously there was a very complex refueling procedure involving lots of aircraft, tankers refueling tankers to put fuel into the Vulcan. Coming back, they were supposed to meet up with a tanker not far from the Brazilian coast. But obviously this is all in pitch black, and I mean, how you formate with a tanker when all you can see are the wingtip lights. And from the cockpit of the Vulcan, you can't actually see the refueling probe. So you've got to get something you can't see into a basket that you can't see on an aircraft that you can't really see, and do all that over thousands of miles of ocean. I mean, it's a miracle they've managed to do any of it. But while they were trying to refuel, the refueling probe snapped off. So they couldn't take on any more fuel. They didn't have enough fuel to get back to Ascension Island. So they basically diverted into Rio de Janeiro, which obviously was neutral during the Falklands. So they had to kind of deceive the air traffic control, because they couldn't sort of say, we're an RAF Vulcan, because they wouldn't have let them land. And ditching in the South Atlantic, they would definitely all have died. So they basically said they're a 4-engine heavy, and they said, well, where have you departed from? And I think one of the crew came from Hull or something, so they said, that was where they departed from. So they said, right, fine, we gave you permission to land. They landed. I can't remember the exact figure, but they had enough the fuel that they had left wouldn't have been enough to do a go-round if they hadn't made it work. But they'd had to open the hatch and ditch all their secret documents. They'd only fired 2 of the 4 missiles they carried, so they fired the other 2, but one of them hung up. So they had to land with a shrike on the aircraft, which had come from the Americans, who were again supposed to be neutral, so we weren't supposed to have these anti-radar missiles. So that got confiscated by the Brazilians. But basically, the aircraft landed safely. The crew were interned and basically shown around Rio de Janeiro. I think it was about 10 days they were there for, and eventually they were released on condition they went back to Britain and took no further part in the Falklands War. But yeah, I mean, it was a very, very narrow thing, and yeah, they really just made it. But as a result of that, on the nose of the aircraft, there's 2 missiles painted for the 2 black buck missions and a little Brazilian flag. So yeah, I mean, it's quite an exciting time for the crew.
It's like what you just said earlier, there and now. It's when people look at it, they see an aircraft, but they don't necessarily think about the actual individual stories, the people that have been in these aircraft and what they've went through, and sometimes how near death they actually were.
Indeed, yeah, and the chap who was the captain, Neil McDougall, was a Scot, and I mean, he only died just very recently, but for the 40th anniversary 2 years ago, we actually had some of the crew here, so there's still a few of the crew left. I mean, one of them was killed a few years later flying Phantoms, but there's still a few of them left. And indeed, one of the crew that from 6 or 7 that did bomb the runway lives in Dumfries and Galloway, so he was here as well. But what's really scary for me is that, yeah, it was the 40th anniversary 2 years ago. At that point, we were further away from the Falklands War in terms of time than the Falklands War was from the end of the Second World War, and that's just mind-blowing. It's, you know, to me, who remembers watching the Falklands War as a young person, it doesn't seem that long ago, but yeah, it's frightening.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to us, Ian. Just before we wrap it up, is there anything else that you'd like to say? Is there anything that's happening at the museum, any events or anything coming up like that? Or do you have any reenactment groups? I heard that you've got a volunteer group. What is it that they do?
Yeah, I mean, we have museum volunteers that come and help us out, and we're volunteer guides that sort of help show people around the museum, open up some of the airliners for visitors to go into. Some of the volunteers also work with the conservation teams. They get to work directly on the aircraft and the collections. So yeah, I mean, if anyone who's interested in volunteering, they should get in touch with us. And if you go to the National Museum's website, which is www.nms.ac.uk, there's details there about how to volunteer. And there's also details there on events. I mean, there's various events going on. We've got a big one on the 31st of this month, 360, it's called. And there's stunt cycling, there's zorballs, various. It's 360 because it's all to do with circles, so there's lots of different things going on. But yeah, check out the website, I'll give you all the details.
Great. Well, again, Ian, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to us, and it's much appreciated, and it was nice speaking to you.
And you, thank you.
Thank you.